Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at doingsofdoyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 10. This time we're taking a look at Conan Doyle's 1891 short story A Straggler of 15 and the play based on it, which came to be known simply as Waterloo. And we have quite a cast of characters both on stage and off, including such luminaries of the late Victorian theatre as Henry Irving, Bram Stoker and George Bernard Shaw. And here's Paul with the synopsis.
A Straggler of 15 is more an extended domestic vignette than a short story. The piece begins with the arrival of young Nora Brewster at Arsenal View, Woolwich, in October 1881 to look after her great-uncle Gregory, a 90-year-old veteran of the Battle of Waterloo. On his wall she notices a medal and a framed newspaper citation recording his heroism during the defence of the Hougoumont farm complex. She realises her great-uncle is no ordinary old man. This is confirmed by a succession of visitors, including members of the local artillery garrison and the current commanding officer of the Scots Guards, Brewster's old regiment. A more ominous presence, however, is the local doctor, and as Nora grows closer to one of the most regular callers, Sergeant Archie MacDonald, and dreams of the future, Corporal Gregory Brewster dwells evermore upon the past and the inevitable reunion with his Waterloo comrades.
Let's begin with the writing and publication history of the short story A Straggler of 15. The story was written in summer 1890. We have evidence that Conan Doyle sent the story to his new agent, A.P. Watt, around about the 25th of September 1890. That's a letter in the Berg collection in New York. And Watt, in turn, sold the story to a new weekly review, Black and White magazine, which ultimately published the story on the 21st of March, 1891. And it was also published in Harper's Weekly in the United States on the same day. As an aside, both versions are accompanied by illustrations by William B. Wallen, who would eventually go on to illustrate the Brigadier Gerard stories. Now, the immediate inspiration for the story was almost certainly the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, the battle having taken place on the 18th of June, 1815. And according to W.D. King, whose volume Henry Irving's Waterloo came out in 1993, there was a deluge of publications that celebrated the anniversary. But there is also a deeper-rooted interest in Waterloo and Napoleon for Conan Doyle. His mother had told him tales of her ancestor, Major General Sir Dennis Pack, who led Pack's brigade at Waterloo. And when Conan Doyle visited London in 1874 at the age of 15, he visited Madame Tussaud and its waxwork diorama, The Shrine of Napoleon. At that time, the Madame Tussauds was located in the Baker Street Bazaar. And it was also on that visit that he first saw Irving play Hamlet, which we'll come to later. So the story, A Straggler of 15, was then included in the collection Round the Red Lamp, a collection of medical tales, which we've mentioned in this podcast series before. It's an odd one, mixing medicine and Gothic stories, and indeed in the case of Sweethearts and A Straggler of 15, something nearer to melodrama. And the story was then relocated to a collection called Tales of the Ring and Camp in 1922, which, as the name suggests, includes boxing stories and military adventures. And Straggler is one of several Napoleonic works that Conan Doyle wrote around this time. There's A Foreign Office Romance in 1894. There's obviously the Brigadier Gerard stories, which he starts writing in 1894 as well. And there's also The Great Shadow, written in spring 1892, which features a very detailed description of the Battle of Waterloo. So let's start with the Battle of Waterloo itself. Paul, can you set the scene of what happened at the Battle of Waterloo?
Yeah, the Battle of Waterloo was the culminating battle of a short campaign in June 1815, following Napoleon's return from exile on the island of Elba and his attempt to reassert his power as Emperor of France. So before the main battle, there were three smaller battles fought at Quatre Bras, Wavre, and Ligny, which involved both Allied British forces and Prussian forces. The main battle itself has been brilliantly encapsulated by the writer George MacDonald Fraser, famous for his Flashman series,
Mm.
who writes of it. In its very simplest terms, the French occupied a slope facing the British and their allies on the crest opposite. Napoleon delivered a left hook at Hougoumont, a farmhouse on the British right front, and was stopped by the Guards. He assaulted across the valley throughout the day, with cavalry and infantry, and the British held on. With the Prussians under Blucher arriving, Napoleon made a last dramatic effort, launching the Old Guard at the Allied centre. The British Guards drove them back. Wellington said, "Oh, damn it, in for a penny, in for a pound," and advanced his whole force, and that was the Battle of Waterloo. So that's in a very, very simple form.
And Fraser really does bring out there the central importance of Hougoumont in the
Yeah.
Battle of
Mm.
Waterloo. So tell us a bit more about that, because that's central to the story of Corporal Brewster.
Hougoumont was really the linchpin of Wellington's western flank, and absolutely had to be held to prevent the potential rolling up of his army's right wing and centre. So thus he placed companies from all three Guards regiments in and around the farm, together with units from the King's German Legion, supported by Brunswickers, Hanoverians, and Nassauers, mostly light infantry, trained to act as independent skirmishers.
Mm.
The Battle of Waterloo actually began at around 11:30 in the morning with an attack on Hougoumont, which was probably intended as a diversionary feint to keep its garrison occupied and to draw troops from Wellington's centre, which was to be the real focus of Napoleon's main attack. But whatever the intention, the fierce fighting around Hougoumont took on a momentum of its own. At one point, a party from the French First Light Infantry, led by the axe-wielding Sous-Lieutenant Legros, who was known as l'Enfonceur, the Smasher, broke through the North Gate, but a counterattack led by Lieutenant Colonel James MacDonnell of the Second Guards, the Coldstream Guards,
Mm.
retook the gate. And this battle within a battle raged all day at massive cost to the French, who never took the site, despite their artillery burning down the chateau itself and some of its outbuildings. The garrison held without the need for major reinforcements. They got some units drafted in throughout the day, the ones
Mm.
when Wellington could spare. If Wellington had to put more reinforcements in, it would have drained his centre, allowing Napoleon's main attack possibly to smash through, especially when the other main farmhouse involved in the battle, Les Saintes, which was held by the King's German Legion, fell after its garrison did run out of ammunition.
Ah.
So unlike Les Saintes, Hougoumont did manage to keep its ammunition going and managed to hold out. And this whole the supply of ammunition is one of the central or the central point of Conan Doyle's story, Straggler of 15.
Mm. And Corporal Brewster's role in replenishing the ammunition of the garrison is central to A Straggler of 15. And Conan Doyle neatly covers the backstory in a newspaper clipping which contains his citation.
Yes, and in that citation, Conan Doyle neatly summarises the important role of the defence of Hougoumont in the wider picture of the battle itself, and manages to provide this standout singular story of heroism. So I'll just quote part of the citation. It appears that on the ever-memorable 18th of June, 4 companies of the Third Guards and of the Coldstreams, under the command of Colonels Maitland and Byng, held the important farmhouse of Hougoumont at the right of the British position. At a critical point of the action, these troops found themselves short of powder. Seeing that Generals Foy and Jérôme Bonaparte were again massing their infantry for an attack on the position, Colonel Byng dispatched Corporal Brewster to the rear to hasten up the reserve ammunition. Brewster came upon 2 powder tumbrils of the Nassau Division and succeeded, after menacing the drivers with his musket, in inducing them to convey their powder to Hougoumont. In his absence, however, the hedges surrounding the position had been set on fire by a howitzer battery of the French. and the passage of the carts full of powder became a most hazardous matter. The first tumbril exploded, blowing the driver to fragments. Daunted by the fate of his comrade, the second driver turned his horses, but Corporal Brewster, springing upon his seat, hurled the man down, and urging the powder cart through the flames, succeeded in forcing his way to his companions. To this gallant deed may be directly attributed the success of British arms, for without powder it would have been impossible to have held Hougoumont, and the Duke of Wellington had repeatedly declared that had Hougoumont fallen, as well as Les Saintes, he would have found it impossible to have held his ground.
And that really positions how Brewster's action is so central to the success of this incredibly important military victory. It's almost a Russian doll effect, isn't it? That within the Battle of Waterloo, there is another, which is the action around Hougoumont. And then within Hougoumont, there is actually the actions of Brewster. And so ultimately, on the actions of one individual, the fate of the battle turns.
Yes, essentially the idea that Conan Doyle's playing with here is had Brewster not got the ammunition through to Hougoumont, the French would have been able to roll up Wellington's right wing and smash into his centre from the flank.
And it's almost like Conan Doyle is playing with the notion of the great man theory of history, where we usually think about great individuals such as Napoleon or Wellington. And in this case, it's an ordinary man. And on his individual brave actions, the success of the action.
The fate of nations may depend.
Indeed, indeed. And Conan Doyle appears to have based Brewster's action on a reported incident.
It says the incident appeared in a letter written to the historian Captain William Syborn by Captain Horace Beauchamp Seymour, who was an aide-de-camp of Lord Uxbridge, Wellington's second in command. And he wrote to Syborn to say, "Late in the day of the 18th, I was called to by some officers of the 3rd Guards defending Hougoumont to use my best endeavours to send them musket ammunition. Soon afterwards, I fell in with a private of the wagon train in charge of a tumbril on the crest of the position. I merely pointed out to him where he was wanted, when he gallantly started his horses and drove straight down the hill to the farm, to the gate of which I saw him arrive. He must have lost his horses, as there was a severe fire kept on him. I feel convinced that to that man's service the Guards owe their ammunition." It's interesting that this differs from Doyle's account of the same incident, essentially, in a number of ways. One is that Seymour meets the wagon driver, who's a private in the wagon train, rather than the pair of tumbrils that Conan Doyle brings in, that are manned by Nassauers, who were German allies of the British. Doyle seems to use the incident to show the cowardice of the Nassauers and the heroism of the British, and this is a typical sort of national prejudice around Waterloo, which was a constant throughout the 19th century. That the battle was won purely by the British element of the Allied army, and forgets the Dutch, Belgian, and German elements that were also in there. And then there's a second area where Conan Doyle changes the wagon train driver into a guardsman. He thereby glamorizing the character, because the wagon train isn't such a glamorous regiment, although their work was absolutely essential to the army. So Doyle has to, or Doyle feels he has to, kind of glamorize the character a bit more. And this sort of prejudice is actually does carry on to a certain extent to the present time. It's interesting going back to the George MacDonald Fraser quote, that Fraser deliberately picks out the Guards, and this is the British Guards, and makes out that it was down to them completely, that the day was won. Fraser, as a modern writer, still writes out the Allied elements of the British Army commanded by Wellington, or the Allied British Army commanded by Wellington. And ultimately, this kind of prejudice and this approach to the Battle of Waterloo, particularly from British historians, it could really be traced back to the Duke of Wellington himself, who after the battle remarked that no troops but the British could have held Hougoumont, and only the best of them at that. So Wellington himself was almost denying the presence of the Nassauers and Brunswickers at Hougoumont.
Mhm. Now, Seymour's letter is something of a puzzle at the heart of A Straggler of 15 because we don't quite know when or if Conan Doyle read the original letter. W.D. King suggested that Conan Doyle might have been particularly influenced by a volume entitled Waterloo Letters by Herbert Siborne, which was a compilation of hitherto unpublished letters from officers of the Waterloo campaign that had originally been collected by Herbert's father, Captain William Siborne, in the 1830s. Um, but unfortunately, that volume came out too late for Conan Doyle to read for the writing of A Straggler of 15. We know that he wrote it in September, or at least submitted it to A.P. Watt in September 1890, and Waterloo Letters didn't come out until 1891, which is too late, as Cliff Goldfarb's pointed out. And we have good evidence that Conan Doyle read Siborne because he mentions it in Through the Magic Door. He says, "You see that the literature of Waterloo is well represented in my small military library. Of all books dealing with the personal views of the matter, I think that Siborne's Letters, which is a collection of the narratives of surviving officers made by Siborne in 1827, is the most interesting." There was an earlier history of Waterloo written by Captain William Siborne, drawing on the letters, including a 2-volume edition in 1844, but that doesn't refer to the Seymour incident either. So we're left with a bit of a puzzle as to how Conan Doyle got hold of this story, if indeed he did.
So where did Conan Doyle get this story from? It's too close to Horace Seymour's account of the story of the wagon train driver to be coincidence. Somehow Conan Doyle has got hold of this story,
Hmm.
and there's also the name Brewster. Where did Conan Doyle get the name from? Because during our research into this podcast, we found out that the Museum of the Royal Corps of Logistics actually has a silver Waterloo medal, which isn't the official Waterloo medal, which was issued to all troops. It's a privately made medal inscribed "Reward of Bravery to Corporal Brewster, R.W.T., Royal Wagon Train, from the officers of the Coldstream Guards for his action at Waterloo in the 18th, 1815."
Hmm.
Now, the origins of this medal are quite obscure. I've spoken to the curator, and it was bought from a collector who'd bought it at auction in America. So how it got to America in the first place is a story in itself, which is
Hmm.
one we wonder about. But we don't know when the medal was made. A previous curator does seem to think that it's of the period.
Yeah.
So it's probably somewhere between 1815 to 1830, somewhere in that sort of time. And it just makes you wonder: did Conan Doyle see this medal?
Hmm.
Where has it been before it ended up at auction in America? Is this the origins of the name Brewster for Gregory Brewster? The mystery almost deepens.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, conceivably, because this isn't an official Waterloo medal, this could conceivably be produced by officers in gratitude to this individual. But one of the questions we had was this a stage prop? But it would appear that it has too much silver content and too much detail for it to
Yeah,
be
and
actually a stage prop.
yes, it's too detailed. The audience wouldn't be able to see the actual engraving, and it's also the fact that if this were a stage prop, it would more than likely be from the third guards, not the second guards,
Yes.
because Brewster in the story is actually a corporal in the third guards.
And Brewster's not in the wagon train either.
No. I mean, one of the other stories which has appeared around this Private Brewster, who appears to have been, he could have been Joshua or Joseph, Brewster or Brewer.
Hmm.
And then another story that's built around him is that for his actions, he was promoted from the Royal Wagon Train into the Third Guards as a corporal.
Ah.
But this seems too pat to the
Yeah.
Conan Doyle story. So again, it seems this mixing of fact and fiction, which has surrounded Waterloo. I mean, one example, interestingly connected to this, is Captain Horace Seymour, who
Mm.
told the story to Cyborn, was actually the basis for a character, Captain Trevanion, I think it was, in Charles Lever's novel Harry Lorrequer, published in 1838. So Seymour himself was a larger than life character who's described as the biggest and strongest man in the British Army, and he seems to have been a kind of real life character who took on a fictional life, almost like Life Guardsman Shaw, who was one of the famous characters of Waterloo, who was a pugilist in the Life Guards, and he died at Waterloo, and he took on, after his death, he became almost a fictional character. So there's all sorts of mixing of fact and fiction around the Battle of Waterloo as the battle itself attains a level of myth and legend around itself.
Mm. Fascinating stuff, really.
Mm.
And if anybody listening to the podcast has any more information about this medal, we'd be delighted to hear. There are some other possible inspirations that people have suggested along the way for the story. They're nothing quite as compelling as the Seymour letter, or hopefully this medal. And a couple of contemporaries wrote of possible influences on Conan Doyle. Lyman Beecher Glover, the drama critic of the Chicago Times-Herald, suggested that Conan Doyle may have been influenced by an earlier play entitled Napoleon's Old Guard, later revised to The Old Guard, which was written by Irish actor and playwright Dion Boucicault in 1836. And that is a tale about a Waterloo survivor, Captain Haversack, a member of Napoleon's Imperial Guard, so it's on the French side this time. And he has a similar ending to Corporal Brewster as he runs in with a musket, reliving his glory days before promptly dying on stage. And the play was an incredibly popular one on both sides of the Atlantic, but there's no evidence of it being played at the Lyceum. Nevertheless, Conan Doyle may have seen it. Another influence suggested by a contemporary was Hubert von Herkomer's painting The Last Muster, painted in 1875, which is an amazing portrait. It shows the Chelsea pensioners attending morning service, and one of the soldiers has died in the pews while his neighbour checks his pulse, and it's an incredibly tragic image. And that was suggested by a reviewer in the Daily Telegraph on 22nd September 1894. One of the most appealing suggestions that's been made has come from Cliff Goldfarb, who suggested that W.B. Wallen, who would ultimately go on to illustrate A Straggler of 15 and indeed the Brigadier Gerard stories, had done an illustration entitled My Old Regiment, which was published in the Illustrated London News on the 21st of March 1889. And it shows an old soldier in his garden looking over the picket fence, saluting his regiment as it walks past. And Conan Doyle had certainly read the Illustrated London News, so it's plausible he saw the work, although there's no evidence that Conan Doyle then made any suggestion that Wallen should be the illustrator for the Gerard stories or indeed Straggler. But those are a number of other alternative potential influences, though I think none as compelling as the Seymour account.
It's quite fascinating with you mentioning the Chelsea pensioners pictures as well, because in a book which came out in 2015 to coincide with the bicentenary of the Battle of Waterloo, Gareth Glover's Waterloo in 100 Objects, he reproduces an 1880 photograph entitled Last Survivors of Waterloo in Chelsea Hospital, June 1880. And on it are John Mackay of the 42nd Regiment, who's 95 years old, Nash Hannay of the 7th Hussars, 88 years old, Benjamin Bumstead, 73rd Regiment, 82 years old, and lastly, Sampson Webb of the 3rd Foot Guards, who is 82 years old, who this would be an exact contemporary of Corporal Brewster in the same regiment.
Well, that's incredible.
Mm.
Yeah, and we know from the Times at around the time of the 75th anniversary, saying that there were by then, that's 1890, no British survivors of the battle among the Chelsea pensioners. So
the last survivor, again, this is according to Gareth Glover, the last known British survivor who was actually old enough to fight at the Battle of Waterloo was Maurice Shea of the 73rd Foot, who died in 1892. And the same gent is mentioned in Nick Fuchs' book Dancing into Battle. Says that Maurice Shea died in Canada aged 97.
Yeah, and there was a New Statesman report about 5-6 years ago that noted that the last survivor of Waterloo was a chap called Louis Victor Bayot, who was 22 at the time of the battle and died in 1898 at the grand age of 104. Now, we said at the outset that A Straggler of 15 ultimately was turned into a very successful stage play, which became known as Waterloo. Now, the idea for turning Straggler into a play was not Conan Doyle's. He'd previously attempted and ultimately abandoned a play called Angels of Darkness, which shares its Mormon plotline with A Study in Scarlet. It's not a terribly great achievement. And you can see why Conan Doyle abandoned it. Although it is notable because it introduces a San Francisco doctor called Watson. And jury's out on whether or not it was written before or after A Study in Scarlet. In terms of the naivety of the writing, I'm tempted to think it's probably predates A Study in Scarlet. So the idea of actually turning Straggler into a play wasn't Conan Doyle's. It was J.M. Barrie, who would ultimately go on to write Peter Pan. And he suggested Conan Doyle turn Straggler into a play in January 1892. Barrie was looking for a curtain raiser for a new play he had written, Walker London, which was by then in rehearsals. And Conan Doyle was absolutely delighted to be asked and told his mother this would be a good start for writing in the theatre. But Barrie's play was a three-act farce, and his choice of lead was the actor-manager J.L. Toole, who was a comic actor, and Conan Doyle was really unhappy with the choice. Just an aside on J.L. Toole, he was noted for his portrayal of tender-hearted leads in domestic melodramas, including adaptations of Boucicault. So it may well be that Toole had actually performed in Napoleon's Old Guard, which was suggested as one of the possible influences on A Straggler of 15. Having separated with Barrie over the choice of lead actor, Conan Doyle decided to approach Henry Irving. And there has been some suggestion that he wrote the story or the play with Irving in mind. But before he sent it to Irving, he sent the manuscript to George Moore, the Irish novelist and dramatist, and asked whether Moore had any suggestions to make. Moore replied, "I don't know if your play would act, that is to say, if a few alterations would fit it for the stage, but I do know that it made me cry like a child. I think it is the most pathetic thing I ever read in my life," pathetic being used positively in that sense. And that comes from a quote in the biography from Hesketh Pearson. So practically a month after J.M. Barrie suggested that Conan Doyle adapt A Straggler of 15, Conan Doyle sent the piece to Irving, whom he'd admired since his first visit to London at the age of 15. Conan Doyle wrote to his mother, Mary Doyle, on the 26th of February, 1892, saying, "I write to Henry Irving tonight to see if he will produce my veteran play. I wonder what he'll say." And it's at this point that Irving and Bram Stoker come into the picture.
Yeah, their connection goes back to the 1870s. And of course, Stoker is more famous these days as the author of Dracula. But in the 1870s, he was working as a clerk for the Irish Civil Service at Dublin Castle, and also working unpaid part-time as a drama critic for the Dublin Evening Mail. He'd seen Irving perform as Hamlet twice in November, December 1876, and wrote two very enthusiastic reviews of the performance, which delighted Irving. So Irving invited Stoker to meet him at his hotel in Dublin, and at this small gathering, Irving performed one of his party pieces, which was a dramatic reading of Thomas Hood's very melodramatic poem, The Dream of Eugene Aram. And at the end of this performance, Stoker fell into something like a fit of hysterics, which delighted Irving even more. And he ran into this, as Stoker tells it, he ran into a room, came back with a photograph of himself, signed to Stoker, "To my dear friend Stoker, God bless you, Henry Irving." And from there was cemented a friendship and also a relationship of admirer and hero.
Mm.
And in 1878, when Irving took out the lease on the Lyceum Theatre in London, he invited Stoker to become his business manager, which Stoker accepted. He threw up his job at Dublin Castle, which horrified his mother, who thought he was throwing away his life to follow a strolling player. But the whole Lyceum venture at that point was a huge success, and the Lyceum became the centre of or one of the centres of London social life of that era, with Irving and Stoker absolutely at the heart of it.
Mm,
So when Doyle sent the play version of A Straggler of 15 to Irving, he was aiming high.
mm,
And we do actually get a sense in The Sign of the Four of the Lyceum's place in London social life. When Holmes, Watson, and Mary Morstan meet Thaddeus Sholto, representative, at the third pillar from the left outside the Lyceum Theatre.
mm,
And Watson comments, at the Lyceum Theatre, the crowds were already thick at the side entrances. In front, a continuous stream of hansoms and four-wheelers were rattling up, discharging their cargoes of shirt-fronted men and beshawled, bediamonded women, which shows that the Lyceum was really a centre of social life and money.
mm. And the play itself, we think, fell into the hands of Stoker first.
Yes, Stoker records this in his personal reminiscences of Henry Irving, which he wrote in 1906, following Irving's death the year before. And as Stoker tells the story, he says, one day early in March 1892, whilst we were rehearsing Tennyson's play The Foresters, Irving came into the office in a hurry. He was a little late. As he came hurrying out to the stage, he stopped beside my table where I was writing, and laying a parcel on it, he said, I wish you would throw an eye over that during rehearsal. It came this morning. You can tell me what you think of it when I come off. I took up the packet and unrolled a number of typewritten sheets, a little longer than foolscap. I read it with profound interest, and was touched by its humour and pathos to my very heart's core. It was very short, and before Irving came in again from the stage, I had read it a second time. When he came in, he said presently, in an unconcerned way, by the way, did you read that play? Yes. What did you think of it? I think this, I said, that play is never going to leave the Lyceum. You must own it at any price. It is made for you. So I think too, he said heartily. You had better write to the author today and ask him what cheque we are to send. We had better buy the whole rights. Who is the author? Conan Doyle. And there's an interesting point there, a little aside on Conan Doyle, where Stoker's talking about the receipt of this package. When he describes it, I took up the packet and unrolled a number of typewritten sheets, and Doyle did tend to send his manuscripts rolled rather than flat.
Yes, he did. Yeah. And Conan Doyle and Bram Stoker became pretty good friends.
Yeah, they moved in similar circles, which included the Argonauts Club and the Irish Literary Society, which Stoker had co-founded, and their friendship grew to such an extent that Stoker and his wife Florence were actually invited to Conan Doyle's second wedding in 1907.
Mm. And Conan Doyle was very complimentary of Stoker's writings. There's a notable letter about Dracula, but also he wrote to him in 1902 to congratulate him on The Mystery of the Sea, in which Conan Doyle mentioned Stoker's Celtic imagination and glamour.
And it's interesting with that side of things, the Celtic side of things, that these two men, both of Irish origins and background, come from very different traditions within that. With Conan Doyle coming from Catholic origins, and Stoker being very much part of the Protestant ascendancy.
Hmm. Now, W.D. King is somewhat skeptical of this version of events, and says it certainly benefits from hindsight, but he doesn't actually offer an alternative explanation. Certainly, Irving did buy the rights outright for £100, and once it was successful, he paid Conan Doyle an additional guinea per performance in gratitude, supposedly.
Yes, this is what Conan Doyle claims, but he might have been unfair to Sir Henry, because according to the historian Geoffrey Richards in his 2005 study of Irving, Irving actually paid Doyle 2 guineas per performance.
And given there were 345 performances overall, that's £700. on top of the original
Yes,
£100. So,
and considering that the rights are, that Irving was just going to buy the rights outright,
mm,
it's a nice, cash cow on top.
yeah, absolutely. And according to Stoker, Irving only asked Conan Doyle to consolidate the first few pages. King does have a very complete study of the amendments, and he does confirm that, in March 1892, Irving, via Stoker, asked that the two women who are at the beginning of the play were dropped. They're a sort of unnecessary bit of scene setting, and they're replaced by the grand niece to set the scene. There's also a earlier draft from February 1893, which has a longer final scene between Nora and Sergeant MacDonald, her love interest. And there are later drafts that remove the family legend that Brewster could fell an ox, and the colonel's aside that it would be much better if Brewster died at Hougoumont. And there are some various additional stage directions that are added, perhaps capturing Irving's actions in rehearsal. Now, there has been a suggestion that the play was adapted in such a way as to draw on Erkman Chatrian's The Bells, which was a popular piece, almost synonymous with Henry Irving. But I think that's somewhat unlikely, given that the first performance of Straggler of 15 was on the same billing as The Bells. It's hardly likely that you would put the two on the same opening night.
Yes, the audience. Haven't we just seen this?
Mm. But perhaps the most lasting change to A Straggler of 15 was obviously the title. The play had been submitted to Irving as A Straggler of 15, and the play that is recorded as being submitted to the Lord Chamberlain's office on the 14th of February 1893 was also titled A Straggler of 15. But that copy, which still exists within the British Library in London, has the title scored through in pencil and replaced with the title A Story of Waterloo. The first three words were subsequently dropped during the run.
But presumably this was done for reasons of trying to attract an audience. If you put the word Waterloo in, it will intrigue and attract more people.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the production of the play. It actually took 2.5 years before Irving first performed Waterloo. It was first performed at Bristol on the 21st of September 1894. And some people have suggested that it was performed in the provinces, as it were, to protect it from negative reviews. But actually, there were whole armies of reviewers who arrived in Bristol on train to review the opening night. Conan Doyle himself wasn't present at the performance. He was due to set sail with Innes for a lecture tour of America the following day. And according to A Life in Letters, a short time later, Conan Doyle had dinner with the editor of the Chicago Times, who'd been present at the performance and told him that the play had been an enormous success. It finally opened at the Lyceum on the 4th of May, 1895, and W.D. King describes how it immediately became a cultural phenomenon. Reviewers tended to eulogize Irving, but some of them were a little bit more reserved about the play, although there is some debate as to how far the success of Waterloo is down to Irving and how far it is actually down to the quality of the writing.
Yeah, someone who commented on this later on was the writer Thomas Anstey Guthrie, who wrote under the pen name F. Anstey novels such as Vice Versa. But he was part of a gang of writers and artists who would almost hang out at the Lyceum. Anthony Hope, the author of Prisoner of Zenda,
Mm.
was another. In his autobiography, A Long Retrospect, he talks about the world of the Lyceum and Irving, and he talks about Irving's performances in Faust, the Leon Mail, and the Bells, and says, and all these three plays were poor enough in themselves. It was Irving's genius that gave them their life and magic. But then he goes on to discuss Waterloo. And says, as Sergeant Brewster in the late Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's excellent one-act play Waterloo, Irving, perhaps for the only time, was unrecognisable. Nothing could have been truer or more moving than his dying Peninsular veteran. We'll excuse him getting it wrong that it's Corporal Brewster. He's actually Waterloo, not a Peninsular veteran. But he's obviously very, very taken with Doyle as a writer here, as well as Irving's performance.
Mm, mm. Indeed, but not everybody was a fan. There's a very famous and quite hilarious um, caustic review of Waterloo by George Bernard Shaw, entitled "Mr. Irving Takes Paregoric," which skewers Irving, and it felt to be a hallmark in theatre criticism, marking the end of a sort of unspoken collusion between the theatre and critics, both of whom were obviously dependent on plays to be in work, and it's the start of the emergence of a gloves off form of critiquing, which we can sadly see to this day. Conan Doyle and Bernard Shaw had a fairly difficult relationship. Famously, they were neighbours in Hindhead, and Conan Doyle at that time was living in a house called Undershaw, which came to have a second meaning to the name. There was already some bad blood between Conan Doyle and Bernard Shaw by the time that Waterloo was first performed. Bernard Shaw had given an incredibly negative review of Conan Doyle's first stage play, the ill-fated Jane Annie or the Good Conduct Prize, which was written with J.M. Barrie, which Bernard Shaw described as the most unblushing outburst of tomfoolery that two responsible citizens could conceivably indulge in public. And they would go on to have a series of public spats, including a public meeting in 1899 where Conan Doyle spoke in favour of disarmament to be opposed by his neighbour Bernard Shaw, and probably most famously over the Titanic in 1912, where Bernard Shaw was incredibly critical of the outpouring of what he described as romantic lying in journalistic accounts, which had lauded British virtues, and he sort of drew into question Captain Smith's heroism, and Conan Doyle came immediately to the rescue. He he came back in one letter to Bernard Shaw with some wonderful backhanded magnanimity. The worst I think or say of Mr. Shaw is that his many brilliant gifts do not include the power of weighing evidence, nor has he that quality, call it good taste, humanity, or what you will, which prevents a man from needlessly hurting the feelings of others. Of course, Bernard Shaw sort of won the battle over Captain Smith over time, who's not not done well history. Um, but they did actually agree over some things. They agreed over Roger Casement in particular, and they both collaborated to try and have Casement's death sentence commuted. So, in his review, Mr. Irving Takes Paregoric, which appeared in the Saturday Review of the 11th of May, 1895, um, Bernard Shaw writes that critics are unable to discriminate between the execution done by the actor's art and that done by Mr. Conan Doyle's ingenious exploitation of the ready-made pathos of old age. It is my steady purpose to do what I can to drive such sketches as A Story of Waterloo, with their ready-made feelings and prearranged effects, away to the music hall, which is their proper place. Bernard Shaw was very much in pursuit of high art and higher meaning through realism, and he definitely seems to have reacted incredibly negatively to both Irving's performance and indeed the subject matter. He did approach the same material in a play, The Man of Destiny, which he started writing in 1895 around the same time as this very acerbic review, and was first. And that play was first performed in 1897, but with far less popular success than Waterloo. But it wasn't just Bernard Shaw who took a dislike to the play and indeed to Conan Doyle. The editor of the Saturday Review between 1894 and 98 was Frank Harris, an Irish-American novelist and short story writer, whose autobiography, My Life and Loves 1931, is famously lewd. Harris may have written an anonymous review of Waterloo in the Saturday Review that predated Shaw's first column with the magazine, and Harris intensely disliked Conan Doyle, considering him far too commercial, and in a very nasty aside in the 1920s described God as being uncreative, having, quote, mediocre fish-like productivity. He is a prodigious, a giant Conan Doyle.
Harris he was a scurrilous character who just thrived on conflict. And just going back to King's point about the play being a cultural phenomenon, it really did sink into culture, and there's something in Bernard Shaw's rather snide comment that it's more suited to the music hall than the legitimate theatre, as it were,
Mm.
because of its sentimental and populist appeal. which went quite deep. But its success shows how the public loved it, and it's playing on two things in the old age aspect, but also the Waterloo aspect itself. The fact that Waterloo really was, it had sunk into the British popular psyche at this point. It was almost the root of 19th century British success. Once that battle was over, Britain then was free to follow her destiny to become the leading colonial power
Mm.
of the 19th century. And this is really nicely illustrated in 1897, the year of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, when on the 25th of June, 2,000 colonial troops marched from Chelsea Barracks to the Lyceum, where they were treated to a performance of Waterloo. So its power was very much demonstrated by that.
Mm.
And at a very sort of lower cultural level, you can look at something like in 1915, Wills and Co. issued a set of cigarette cards of the Battle of Waterloo, and one of these cigarette cards depicts Private Brewster bringing the cartridges to Hougoumont, actually named him as Private Brewster, which, as we've said, didn't come from Cyborn. So it will be from the popularity of the Conan Doyle stroke Henry Irving play.
Mm. I mean, for all, Bernard Shaw was indeed very negative about at least Irving's performance. I mean, you can't doubt that A Straggler of 15 and Waterloo have, pack an emotional punch. Conan Doyle himself, in Memories and Adventures, perhaps with rather more than a glint of hindsight, said that my eyes were moist as I wrote it, and that is the surest way to moisten the eyes of others. To modern readers, I think the story can feel somewhat sickly and sentimental, but there are some moments that really do tug at the heartstrings. Even now, I think Brewster's entrance, but there's a moment where he breaks his pipe, and it symbolizes the fragility of old age, and then this final moment when he is reliving his moment at Hougoumont, where he's shouting, the guards need powder" before he dies. It's very different to anything that we would find acceptable or stimulating today, but it still does manage to pull at the heartstrings, and I think it does show how Conan Doyle understood how to stimulate emotion in the reader, something that even Bernard Shaw recognized in his critical review of Waterloo.
And I think even today, with our different sensibilities, I think in particular the whole scene with the pipe does work, because in its very simplicity, this man who in his younger days has passed through this battle which was sheer hell on earth,
Mm.
in which the slaughter was at First World War levels. He's experienced this, and then as an old man, he can be moved to tears
Mm.
by simply breaking his favourite pipe.
It's very powerful stuff, and interestingly, as a short play, if you take the play version, it has incredible tonal shifts within the matter of a few minutes. I mean, to perform the whole play is what, half an hour
Mm.
probably, and it starts with Brewster emerging as a picture of pathetic old age, and then it's almost amusing senility. Then he becomes more pathetic with the pipe almost, and then there's more amusing moments and quaintness, and then incredible dignity as well. And it varies between the tragic and the comic, showing Conan Doyle's command of the material. And probably the final word on the play comes from W.D. King, who says this: "Spiritual transcendence was an idea at the heart of the play, spirit rising above the crude machine of the body and the physical world," which is very relevant when you think about Conan Doyle's spiritualism and his beliefs in later life.
And it can also be seen to tie in with some of his later fiction that's coming up before the First World War. This is end of an era stuff. This is
Mm.
almost predicting here's this man who's fought at Waterloo, which, as I've previously mentioned, is seen as the battle which helped to launch this great 19th century British Empire, that he's dying at the time that the empire itself is about to face great peril at the end of the 19th century. This is just before the high mark of the high watermark of British imperialism. All fits very symbolically.
Mm-hmm. So that brings us to the end of episode 10. Paul, what are we looking at next time?
Next time, we're going to tackle a Sherlock Holmes story for the first time in the podcast. We're looking at a story of mystery and diablerie in Cornwall in the Devil's Foot.
So join us next time for some Sherlockian shenanigans. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye. So that brings us to the end of episode 10 and A Straggler of Waterloo.
Whatever.
Whatever it's called. Whatever he called it.